Good evening, everyone. We're continuing with our, what I hope you think is wonderful, I think it's wonderful, exploration of Swami's Book of Letters. So before we begin, let's start with a prayer, and then we'll have a few minutes of meditation before we start talking. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. We live our lives in deep devotion with a heartfelt desire to be in harmony with your will. Yet every day, confusing thoughts of self interfere with our aspirations, cloud our minds, compel our hearts, speak strongly within us, and even when we err, call us back quickly, that we may see your light and follow your footsteps. The greatest happiness lies in attunement with thee. Guide us and bless us, that we may live in that greatest happiness. Om, peace. Amen. Let's meditate now for a few minutes before we start. Om, peace. Amen. All right, my friends. So here we are. And we are in the section of the book called Writing, which I thought was going to be sort of obscure, but it's actually turned out to be, I hope you think so, it's actually turned out to be quite interesting. Because as I was saying last week, not everybody writes, although everybody writes a little, but everybody uses words. So just learning how Swami used words and why he used them and how he made his presentations, it's all turned out to be much more universal than I thought. Since part of my fundamental karma with Swamiji was learning how to write, it was something he trained me in from the beginning. And I dare say he finally succeeded, but it took him decades to do so. I, of course, find this particularly interesting. So let's see. So now, it was Swami's habit, as I explained before, but when he would be working on a book, he had a group of first readers. I really don't know how many it was, at least 24, maybe more. And who knows who else he sent it to. That was just sort of a list of people. And he would just send the chapters of his books as he would write them for feedback. He did it for two reasons. One was genuinely because he wanted feedback. When you're all alone writing something, you sometimes can't really see it objectively. And the other was just to keep us in tune with him. Because when we knew what he was working on and what he was thinking about, it helped keep the magnetism of everyone that he was working with strong. And then, so some of these letters are feedback from manuscript versions, and some of it is feedback on other books, just for other reasons. So here we are. He wrote this in August of 2001 to a devotee offering a possible addition to Kriyananda's book, Hope for a Better World. I sort of pulled the books off my shelf. And I don't know whether, when I hold these up, whether these are actually the covers that you're going to find, because what I tend to have is the first edition of these books, and then I wouldn't have rebought it. Hope for a Better World, the Small Community Solution. He wrote this, I believe, in 2001, and let's see what the copyright is. Here it is, 2002. And it was an effort to talk about the problems primarily of Western civilization, and that Master's suggestion of small intentional communities would solve a great many of the seemingly insoluble problems of our age. You have to bear in mind that Swami was writing for the future, not for the present. I can talk more about communities in a minute if it's relevant. So this is August 2001. The book was published in 2002, so it was still a work in progress. Although later on, he actually rewrote that book. I think he published 4 editions in 1 year. That comes in a later letter. Dear whoever, and I don't know who wrote this, thank you for your comments. As for your personal reaction, the door must be left open for these without saying them all. Otherwise, one gets into what the German philosophers love to do, plug every hole, but befog the overall trend. It's lecturing to an audience and responding specifically to a question that everyone, in such a way that everyone else is left mystified. He said, writing like that is like one person in the room has some obscure concern, and then you add paragraphs or pages to your book, because one person might have that obscure concern, and most of the readers, it's never crossed their mind, and they really don't care about it, and it just really slows the writing down. Swami often refers to the German authors who feel obligated to cover every possible thought that someone can have, whereas Swami, he makes a very good point here. They plug every hole, but befog the overall trend. So you end up not really knowing what the arc of the author's point of view was, because you've gotten so distracted chasing out all these little pieces. So apparently someone who read this book had a very specific response to a very specific comment in the book and felt that it was very important that that be answered. So Swami again refers to in a lecture when someone asks a question, which he did many public lectures and then would invite questions, he would always try to whatever the person was specifically asking, Swami would always try to answer it in a way that it would answer questions that everybody would ask, instead of just some specialized little piece of knowledge. He says, if I were to chase down your unique personal response here and make it part of the whole book, it'll leave most of my audience just wondering what the big noise is about. So then he says, I try to answer questions in such a way that everyone is helped, not just the person I'm answering. If I can't universalize the answer in that way, I prefer to skirt around the issue. Otherwise, it isn't fair to the whole audience. So he's acknowledging, and again, I'm always commenting about how effectively Swamiji answers things. He doesn't say that which he might have felt, that's a really picayune question. You're really chasing down something that you ought to just be able to live with, and I don't know if that's true. He doesn't in any way denigrate the comment itself. He just says, in the context of this book, it's not possible for me to answer it, otherwise the power of the whole book is lost. And this is also, just in general, advice for writers and speakers, which is be clear about what your main points are. And just because there are other points that could be covered, don't allow yourself to get drawn off into them. When I have suggested to people who are just beginning to teach, give classes, or give Sunday services, I always have several pieces of advice, but one of them is, have a very clear idea of what you want your audience to know when you're finished. And have, essentially, I used to have 3 points in my mind. That there were, this was for a Sunday service, which is only like a 20 or 30-minute talk. I'd have 3 clear points, and I would want the audience to have a certain understanding about certain specific things when I finished. And that was a way, both when I was preparing for the talk, and even when I was in the middle of speaking, I could always ask myself whether I was staying with whatever those clear points that I was intent on, rather than just rolling off and riffing off of one thing after another until I was very far away. I don't anymore. Well, sometimes I do. Sometimes I still, I don't need to make that decision ahead of time the way that I used to, because I've been doing this for 40 years. But I still tend to know what my main point is, so that I don't end up touching lightly on 10 things and never going deeply on any specific point. And again, that's what Swami's suggesting for writing and speaking. Universalize your question, and if I can't universalize it, skirt around it, is how he puts it, which is a nice way to put it. So that's a very short letter. Now this is another letter about this book, which is actually, Swami wrote 150 books. So many of them, I remember when a young woman who had come to our community about, after 2000, and Swami asked her if she'd read this book. No, sir. Have you read that one? No, sir, I haven't gotten to that one yet. Have you read this one? No, I haven't. And finally, she said, she happened to be a very short woman, and she finally said, sir, you've written so many. I said, in her defense, I said, Swamiji, I think if you stacked up all your books, they would be as tall as she is. I said, it's not fair. I got to read them as they were written, one at a time, but she's come in when there's 3 bookshelves full. And he laughed, and he completely understood. But it's going to be a long time before people really catch up to everything that Swami did. And this is a little book. It's called Shaped by Saints. And the authorship is actually triple. It was written by this man named Devi Mukherjee, and I'll explain in a moment who he is. And then the book itself was edited and to some extent rewritten, as Swami describes, first by Durga at the village, Nayaswami Durga, and then later by Swami Kriyananda. So let me just give you a little context before, because Swami's writing this book to Devi. Devi is an Indian man, a Bengali, and he was a young man who was a monk in Self-Realization Fellowship in 1958, when Swami Kriyananda went to India on behalf of SRF, and he was in India from 1958 to 1962. And when he arrived in India, Swami himself was a young monk at that time. He would have been in his early 30s, mid-30s at that time. And Devi Mukherjee was a young monk, and they were natural friends. They're close to the same age, if not exactly the same age. And Devi became a very good friend of his. And there were certain things that happened during the 4 years that Swami was in India, including a prominent leader in SRF at that time, a Swami Atmananda, was removed from his position and actually removed from the organization, which is called, in India it's called YSS, Yogoda Satsanga. But YSS in India and SRF in America are one organization with one board of directors. Swami was a young monk. The actions that were taken by older leaders in SRF, and Swami was not privy to the council that went on there. And when I get into the letter, when Swami talks about it more, I'll explain it more. But some things happened there that were disconcerting to Devi at that point. Devi later stopped being a monk, and there was a man named Tulsi Bose, and Tulsi Bose was Master's contemporary, and they were both from Calcutta, and Tulsi Bose and Master were childhood friends and lifelong friends. And Tulsi Bose became Master's emissary in Calcutta after Master left in 1920. Master left in his early 20s, went back to India for a little more than a year in 1935, then returned to America and never returned. So Master had his childhood with Tulsi Bose, and then Tulsi Bose was responsible for the work in Calcutta. Tulsi Bose was from a very distinguished spiritual family that had been devotees of Anandamayi Ma and of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda earlier, going back into the 1800s. And Tulsi had a daughter named Hashi, and Tulsi was, because he was prominent in SRF, he knew Devi Mukherjee as a monk. And I don't know the circumstances, but when Devi decided that he didn't want to be a monk, Tulsi arranged a marriage with his daughter, Hashi. And then Hashi and Devi lived just around the corner from 4 Garpar Road, which was Master's childhood home, and they continued to live in the Bose house, Tulsi Bose's house. And when we all started going to India, starting in 1987, when Swami was still with us at that time, Swami sent us to meet Tulsi and Hashi. And over time, Tulsi and Hashi became very good friends with all of us at Ananda. And whenever we'd go to India, we'd visit with them. A couple of times, Devi and his wife Hashi came to America for special events. So it was a long and wonderful relationship. And when Master went back to India, 1935 and 36, he spent much of that year living with Tulsi Bose and his wife Marthan Ma. And Hashi was actually, she never met Master, but she was born in 1935 or 36. She was born in 36. And she was in her mother's womb when Master was there. And at one point, Master handed Martha Ma an apple and said, "This is for the child in your womb." And so he blessed it, and then she consumed it, and it blessed Hashi. So Hashi considered herself a devotee of, a disciple of Master. Devi was a disciple of Master, although neither of them ever met Master, but they heard stories as when they were young, as children they heard from Tulsi. So, and Durga and Vidura were part of the leadership of the Ananda pilgrimage trips, and both of them have a tremendous gift for friendship. And Durga became, in her inimitable manner, she became very close with Devi and Hashi. And so when Devi decided to write a manuscript about his many experiences, because he'd been a lifelong devotee and he'd wandered in the Himalayas and he'd met many great saints, which is what this book is about, he wrote up the manuscript and he sent it to Crystal Clarity Ananda Publications to turn it into a book. Durga's an excellent writer, and also she has this wonderful simpatico. She has this wonderful ability to expand her consciousness into the consciousness of others. And she actually helped many of those who wrote books about their experiences with Master's direct disciples and other family members in India. Durga helped all of them write their books. I believe Crystal Clarity has been publishing these. Let's see, Meera Ghosh and Hari Krishna Ghosh and others there. Peggy Dietz, she's not Indian, but all of these books. So Durga worked for a long time on this book and then finally felt that she'd done everything she could and she gave it to Swami. And then Swami read it and took it upon himself, you might say, to ghostwrite the book. And he explains to Devi what he's done, and that's what this letter is about. It is an absolutely wonderful story. I had the privilege of knowing Devi and Hashi and meeting them in America and in India. Their house in India, and it's still there, and actually, I believe Ananda's the custodian of it at this point. I think it was arranged, I think we bought it from them after Devi died and before Hashi died. I think we took responsibility for the house. It's filled with relics of our masters. There's a trident in there that Babaji passed to Lahiri Mahashaya that ended up in the house there. Sri Yukteswar used to visit the house there. Of course, Master lived there. So you go in and you sit on the bed that Master slept on when he was there. You go into the meditation room. There's all these holy objects. Many of the beautiful things that are in the shrine of the Masters at Ananda Village were also either loaned or given to us by Hashi and Devi. And Swami maintained a very deep and very warm friendship with Devi and also with Hashi for his whole life until Devi passed before Swami, and then Swami passed before Hashi. Hashi only died a year or two ago. She lived quite a long time. So having said all of that, that's the context of this story. So this happens in May of 2000. Swami writes, "Dear Devi," his name, Devi means goddess, but his name, usually when a man was called Devi, their name would be like Devi Prasad, which means the gift of the goddess. But they end up being called Devi, even though to our limited understanding it sounds like a feminine name. But that was his name. So, dear Devi, first let me give you my overall impression of your manuscript. It is a beautiful book. More than beautiful, it is filled with joy, inspiration, and wisdom. Many, many people will read it and will, I am certain, find guidance and help from it. It's so sweet. See, here Swami just starts out. Devi has sent this manuscript. What does Swami think about it? Swamiji he was so adept at communication. Okay, Devi has poured his heart into this manuscript. He sent it to Swami, who's a brilliant writer and a friend of his, and clearly a spiritual authority. The first thing Devi's going to want to know is, do you like my book? And so often people will say, oh, it's lovely spring weather here. We've been having such a nice time. It's such a relief, when the winter ends. You just go on and on. You don't really care about the weather or anything like that. You want to know, did you like my book? So Swami just says, first, let me give you my impression of your book. Also, he's going to say that he did a lot of editing on the book. So he wants Devi to know that all of that was on the basis of great enthusiasm. Devi, Durga's particular concern was that what you'd written about Binay Dubé might sound negative and might therefore lower the tone of the book. Okay, so there it is, and I have to go right to that. I thought I could go a little farther before I went to there. One of the things that happened in 1958 when Swami was in India, and he went there with Dayamata, Nandamata, Sahajamata, I think may have gone. Dayamata was the president of SRF. Anandamata was on the board of directors. I don't know what her position was. She might have been, no, I don't know what her position was. Swami was a young monk. They were considered to be far his seniors in the work. Swami had been with the work for like 10 years, but they had been there 2 or 3 times that long, and they'd been left with the responsibility. They took Swamiji with them to India and actually assigned him to stay in India and be their representative and try to build the work there. Because from the beginning of Master's time, of Swamiji's time with Master as a young monk, Swami is 22 in 1948. He becomes a monk at Mount Washington. Within 6 months, Master was talking about taking Swami to India with him. And every year, for the 3 years that Swami was there, Master said, this year we'll go to India. And he was going to have Swamiji, who was just in his early 20s, travel around the country and lecture on the teachings and then sort of prepare the way, and Master would come after, and they would campaign around India together. Every year, for one reason or another, the trip didn't happen. And the last time it didn't happen was because Master left his body. But it had been there that Master wanted, that Swami was for India. So after Dayamata took over, and now Master died in 1952, so 6 years after Master passed, Daya and her sister, Anandamata, went to India because they were also the leaders of India, and they went to help the work there. And they were gone, I think they were there a year. And then they left Swami, and Swami stayed 3 more years. And I believe they came back, the women came back once more. While they were there, they met this man, Binay Dubé was his name. He became Swami Shamananda later. And Dayamata was quite taken with Dubé in a very positive way. And he was very effusive and very seemingly very dedicated and very much wanted to help. And so she gave him a great deal of authority over what was happening in India there. But Swamiji did not share Dayamata's high opinion of Dubé, and the Indians who were already established in the work did not share the high opinion of Dubé. And in fact, his influence, according to Swamiji and according to Devi Mukherjee, was catastrophic for the work there. It's hard to know exactly what was going on. But, as Swami often says, the game of chess was invented in India. And later on, people said things to him like, you poor Americans never had any idea what was going on. And bear in mind, they didn't speak the local languages. Swami learned Bengali, but I don't think he learned it. I mean, I'm sure he was beginning to learn it. So a great deal would happen in languages they didn't understand. And I've certainly sat in places where people would say to each other in their native language what they didn't want you to know. And so you often really don't quite know what's happening. One does not want to be suspicious. One wants to take people as they present themselves to you. But sometimes when you're crossing cultures, it can be a little uncertain. So the result of Dubé's involvement was catastrophic for Devi himself, and he wrote honestly and frankly about it. So Durga, who has an extraordinarily sweet and accepting temperament, and it hurts, she's very simpatico. And so it was very hard for her to write. It's very hard for her to write negatively about anyone. It's just not in her nature. She can always see the other person's point of view. So she was there with this book where Devi speaks quite strongly about Dubé, and she really just didn't know what to do. She didn't know what was appropriate, and she didn't know how to do it. And she appealed to Swamiji, because he would have the authority to make a decision like that. She just couldn't figure out how to handle it. So now, with all of that having been said, Durga's particular concern was that what you'd written about Binay Dubé might sound negative and might therefore lower the tone of the book. As I read what you'd written, however, and understood how important it was to you to include that account, I saw that what was needed was not its removal, as Durga had thought, but a longer explanation. In addition, however, I found the whole book so inspiring and beautiful that I put everything aside to devote my full time to working on it and making it into a book that people would be able to read and enjoy without the obstacle of unsophisticated English. Devi spoke English, but and he spoke it quite well, but he wasn't the master of English. Bengali was his natural tongue. At the same time, I feared to inject my own vibrations into the language, since this is your book, not mine. Very sensitive. Swami didn't want the book to sound like him. It needed to sound like Devi, but it needed to be translated, basically, translated into the kind of English, in the kind of language that Devi could have used in his own language. It had to be in English, it had to be as good in English as Devi would have written it in Bengali. Then the solution came to me, to attune myself to your consciousness rather than to your language. This inspiration worked, for I could feel myself sharing in your experiences as if through your mind and eyes. Knowing you personally has been a help to me in this process, but your consciousness, as I read, was very vivid in my mind. The whole book reads as if you've written it, in fact, though the wording is different from what yours would have been. That's such an interesting point, because I think translation is really the right word. You take a book, you write it in a certain language, somebody translates it into another language, and depending how good the translation is, if it's a good translation, it's the person's consciousness, even though the words are different words. It's a very interesting thing to think about. A great many of Swami's books have been translated into Italian by a woman named Sahaja, who just became so adept at writing Italian the way Swami would have written Italian if he'd written it in Italian. And other translations of various of his books over the years, I don't just mean Italian, but in various languages, some of them have been absolutely awful. And when Swami found out how awful they were, we tried again to get someone who had the capacity to attune themselves to his consciousness and didn't just write words. It's a mystery to me because I only speak English, but I've heard him talk about it, and it's interesting in this one, he's actually translating from English to English, but Devi would have thought the book in Bengali. So anyway, so the whole book reads as if you've written it, in fact, though the wording is different from what yours would have been. I could feel your humor, your devotion, and your enthusiasm in everything you'd written. I simply tuned into you. I should add that Durga, too, added enormously to what you'd done, especially to clarify it. What helped both of us most of all, however, was the fact that this really is a marvelous book. Isn't it? It's just so sweet. Now, I have to add to that, Swami never exaggerated. He never used hyperbole. I remember very, very early when I was working as his secretary, people would send Swami lots of different things, and people would send their own writing, their poetry, their essays, their manuscripts sometimes. Somebody had sent Swami some poetry, and I was just beginning to work as his secretary. And I would write letters that he would sign. He would guide me intuitively, and I would write. But he never signed something without reading it, especially at the beginning. So I had written, "Thank you very much for sending me your beautiful poetry." Swami read that on the letter. He said, "The poetry was nice." He said, "But what will you say now when someone sends us actually beautiful poetry?" He said, "Now that you've used up the word beautiful on poetry that was merely nice." And I mean, it was just so vivid in my mind. I'd diminish the word beautiful by applying it to something that wasn't really beautiful. I mean, it wasn't beautiful poetry. It was nice poetry. I mean, it wasn't bad poetry. It was very nice poetry. It might even have been very nice poetry. But it wasn't beautiful because the poet just wasn't that good. But the way Swami put that, now you've changed the meaning of the word beautiful, so what are you going to do next? And it was such a clear understanding of truth. And in Patanjali, they talk about the fact that if you're always truthful, then your words gain the power to manifest. And truthfulness is sincerity. And some people think that they just lavish praise. They always use hyperbole. They tell you you're wonderful, you're marvelous, you're an angel, that was terrific, when it was good. But it wasn't that good. What are you going to do when it's that good? Where do you go after that? And gradually you get farther and farther away from a really sincere relationship with your own words. So we all knew, and I certainly experienced it very directly, so you could always trust Swami. I have to tell you, it's so relaxing to know that a person means exactly what they say. They're not comforting you, they're not trying to make you feel better, they're just telling you the truth. So when Swami tells Devi, this is a really marvelous book, that's not the way he would talk unless he thought it was a really marvelous book. So I really enjoyed that. When I would write, Swami, especially when I was writing badly, most of the time, Swami would always say, I was writing mostly promotional stuff and I would have to get his approval. He said, this is good, this is very good, this is excellent. Sometimes he would say, this will do. But it was always exact, and it was always true. I mean, I could feel it was true. I could tell the difference between something that was excellent and something that was merely good. And when it was only good, I learned, I mean, that's how he trained me. He trained me by always being supportive, but by also being absolutely authentic. So when he says Devi's book is marvelous, there's real power in it because he hasn't wasted those words on things that weren't. And he also, just to go back to my writing letters, I also learned from him, if you can't say that if the poetry is terrible, which sometimes it was, which people would send, but you still wanted to be encouraging, you would say something that was true, like, how wonderful that you're expressing yourself through poetry. Poetry is such a marvelous means to get your feelings, to clarify your feelings, and how kind of you to send me your efforts. I'm always glad to see what you're doing. All of it is true. All of it makes the person feel encouraged, but you've never actually passed a judgment on what kind of poetry it was, because if you said it too frankly, it might be too discouraging, and you don't want to do that. You want them to keep going, and then depending on how receptive the person is, how much more you say. But it has been a wonderful practice that I've followed ever since, to be encouraging, supportive, positive, helpful, and absolutely sincerely truthful. I mean, because hyperbole is easy. Truth takes more concentrated effort. I mean, you can always throw flattering words at something. That's not hard to do. People have different levels of enthusiasm, and so you don't have to be cosmically true. You don't have to say this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning piece, but you may still think it's wonderful. It's that when Swami was talking to me, he has a discriminating eye for literature, and he knows that I did too. So he knew that it wasn't sincere from him, and it wasn't even sincere from me. It was lazy, basically. It was just laziness, and he wasn't going to have that. And he certainly wasn't going to sign a letter that he couldn't vibrate with completely. So again, so this one is a marvelous book. Then here Swami says, the only part where I departed from my attempt to tune into your consciousness was toward the end, where I went into the philosophy of music and Indian versus Western attitudes. This had to be my own edition, not your thoughts, but I made it clear in the manuscript that this section came from me by having you say so, so that people would not be confused by the difference of vibrations. So I don't remember, but I think at a certain point he actually just literally says, you know, I talked to Swami Kriyananda about this, or as Swami Kriyananda said, and then Swami could really express himself. The book is not clear in my mind at this moment as to why it was needed, but it was needed to make the book complete. I thought that the things you said about Dubé, and so now we're back to this difficult situation. I thought that the things you said about Dubé needed to be said, and I also explained those things further. And I never realized how harmful he had been. And Swami was actually, when he read Devi's book, he was actually really heartsick about it. He'd had suspected what Devi wrote, but as I said, he was a young monk. He wasn't really privy to it. He didn't have the same kind of access to what was really going on. He himself, as a young monk there, was sort of struggling to work with this same man. And he'd been left, that man had been left with superior authority to Swamiji. And Swamiji did not, as he writes, he did not respect his superior authority as being more than an organizational situation. Organizationally, he had a superior position, but he had never even met Master. And Swamiji did not feel that he warranted that kind of authority. And so Swamiji was in a difficult position, as he describes here. Swami says, I never realized how harmful he had been. In fact, I began to doubt the rightness of the decision that was taken about Atmananda. Atmananda was another childhood friend of Master's. I believe that's correct. Master had left him in charge of the ashram in Calcutta. When the women came from America, they relieved him of his position. It was reported to them that Atmananda was nefarious in various ways. As Swami writes here, and as he said to us, he was not privy to what was going on, but Atmananda was relieved of his position, and all the monks who were devoted to Atmananda were left without the guidance and the magnetism of the one that they felt was their link to Master. And it had a disastrous effect on them all. And that's probably how Devi came to leave the monasteries, because everything fell apart when this man was relieved of his position. So Swami writes, I began to doubt the rightness of the decision that was taken about Atmananda. The fact that all of you loved him so deeply and sincerely was an important consideration for me. Swamiji once remarked that, it was in the specific example, there is a Swami, I guess he's passed away now too, his name was Chidananda, not the American Chidananda that presently is president of SRF. This was an Indian man who lived in Rishikesh, who was a direct disciple of Swami Shivananda. Shivananda and Master were contemporaries. Shivananda is considered to be a realized soul. He's the founder of the Divine Life Society, which is a worldwide organization and has a beautiful big ashram and work in Rishikesh. Chidananda and Swami Kriyananda in certain ways were comparable. They were peers, and they had comparable positions in relation to their guru, and each of them had a different guru. And when Swami was in India in 1958, is when he met Swami Chidananda. And his guru, Swami Shivananda, was still living at that time. So this is how Swami described it. He went to see Shivananda, and he didn't feel any particular inspiration in Shivananda's company. Now Swami said that was no indication of Shivananda's spiritual stature, because Shivananda was not Swami's guru. And Shivananda was another sampradaya, I think that's the right word, which is another self-realization lineage. And there was no reason why Swami should feel an affinity with the guru. But Swamiji felt very in tune with Swami Chidananda. When Chidananda was living, Swami said, he is the Swami in India that I respect most of all the Swamis in this country. He had a very high regard for him. Chidananda came and visited Ananda village about 1970. And we met him in India on one of our pilgrimage trips. When Swami Kriyananda was with us in Rishikesh, we all went over to visit Swami Chidananda and the two spiritual brothers. There's some wonderful pictures. There might even be pictures in Light Bearer of the two spiritual brothers being together. Just because I'm telling this story. It was so funny. There was 30 of us. It was our pilgrimage trip. Our whole pilgrimage group, all 30 of us, were there in Rishikesh. Swamiji had been in seclusion in Rishikesh. I do write about this in Light Bearer. I talk about his visiting Swami there. And we all went with Swami to pay a visit to Swami Chidananda. And somehow, I only sort of saw this a little bit later, I think those Chidananda's devotees had planned to sort of separate this big crowd of Americans from the two Swamis. I don't know if they were going to stay with them or not. They made some slight attempt to separate us from Swami Kriyananda, and we would have none of it. We just more or less glued ourselves to Swami's coattails, and there was nothing for it except that we would all go into some large room and sit together while the two Swamis talked to each other. Oh, and now I have to finish this because it's such a wonderful memory. I was sitting right next to wherever Swamiji was. And Swami, of course, is the head of a worldwide organization, and Chidananda was the president of the Divine Life Society. Very, from the eyes of the spiritual world, they were both very prominent individuals. They haven't seen each other in a while. Swami Chidananda smiles at Kriyananda, and he says, "And how is Ananda World Brotherhood Community?" Like this. Swami Kriyananda laughs and says, "Fine." And then Swami Kriyananda says to Chidananda, "And how is the Divine Life Society?" And Swami Chidananda goes, "Fine." And then the two of them, just from way down in the belly, they both go, "Ha ha 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 ha." They just laugh, this sort of deep, heartfelt laugh. And I had an interpretation, which I later asked Swamiji about. I said, I felt that he was teasing you and you were teasing him right back. He says, "Well, important sadhu with all your disciples, leader of the big worldwide organization, how is it going for you?" And Swami just took it just like Chidananda gave it, "Oh, just fine." And then asked him the same thing. And then both of them just knew none of that had anything to do with who they really were. Absolutely nothing. And they just laughed at the joke. It wasn't a joke that anybody else could catch, except I guess I was close enough to them, and I caught the joke. And later I confirmed my intuition because I always wanted to. "So that seemed to be what you were doing?" "Oh yes," he said. And for Swamiji it was such a, because you see, Swami was exiled from his Guru Bhais for his entire life. I mean, I only thought about that much later. Swami never had any peers. And he never had the company of people who'd been with Master. About 1993, Master's 100th anniversary, we brought together other disciples who were non-SRF disciples who would come. Roy Eugene Davis, Bob Raymer, Devi and Hashi, Hari Krishna Ghosh, Peggy Dietz. They all came, and they all had been with Master. And there was this wonderful reality. Later, Swami went to Song of the Morning Ranch, which had been started by Oliver Black but was then run by Bob Raymer. Bob Raymer was a direct disciple. There is a video on YouTube if you type in Swami Kriyananda satsang at Song of the Morning Ranch. It's well worth. It's an all-time classic, and partly it was because Swami was with a peer. He was with someone who could resonate with what he was saying. And Bob doesn't speak much, but he's sitting right near Swami, and many times during that, Swami looks over at Bob when he's talking about Master. And Bob could see it too, because Bob had experienced it, which is nothing that any of us could ever give to Swami. We could never give back to him, an echo of what his experience had been. So Swami Chidananda, even though the disciple of a different master, nonetheless vibrated with his guru in the same way Swami vibrated with his guru. So there was such something so remarkable in all of that. Now I have to sort of see where I was in this book, so this is what it was all about. So Swamiji was saying, when he met Shivananda, it was just a neutral experience, but he had such a high regard for Chidananda, and Chidananda was so devoted to Shivananda, that Swami realized that such a man as Chidananda, the fact that Shivananda had won his devotion, he said, spoke volumes about who Shivananda was. Because to win the loyal love of such a high-minded Swami meant that Shivananda had, magnificence in him, or else he wouldn't have been so loyal to him. So here, Swami is talking about that there was a coterie of very devoted disciples of Atmananda. That's how they thought about it. They thought about Atmananda as being their link to Master, but they revered Atmananda as a guru. Excuse me. Every so often my body just decides that some enemy has entered the fort and has to be expelled, but I think it's been expelled now. Anyway, the fact that these refined and high-minded souls were devoted to Atmananda made Swami, as he grew more mature and had time to think about it, highly suspicious of the accusations that had been leveled against Atmananda. Swami realized it was unlikely that a man like Devi Mukherjee would give his loyalty to someone who wasn't worthy of it. So all of this is in hindsight, even in spiritual works, people's until we're free, we're not free. And karma happens. So here it goes. Another important consideration was the fact that all of you, loved him so deeply and sincerely was an important consideration for me. I think Dubé played a significant part in getting Atmananda ousted. So that's why Devi felt he really needed to speak the truth. It was out of loyalty to Atmananda. Devi just couldn't brush this over because he's telling the story of what Atmananda meant to him. And then suddenly Atmananda's in disgrace. And Devi never felt that was warranted. And out of loyalty to Atmananda, he felt he had to speak the truth about it. Okay, that's why Swami says, when I see how important it was to you to say this. And since it's spiritually important, you see. It was very interesting whenever there was a significant attack against Master in any context, which happened periodically, there was this whole cycle where this poor man had been told by his mother, I think his mother was light-skinned and he was dark-skinned. He was clearly part Indian. And she was either unmarried or married to someone else, I don't know. But his mother always told him that Yogananda was his father. Eventually, there was actually a DNA test because it reached such proportions. And all of it came out in this magazine. It was awful. We all got kind of caught. I personally got caught up into it because of this reporter, and he seemed to be doing a good story, and then instead it turned out to be this awful expose against Master, with this assertion that he'd fathered an illegitimate child that he'd refused to recognize, and it was awful. And then we were sort of interwoven there. I was sort of interwoven there. It was bad. It was one of the worst days of my life when that article came out. And I had been instrumental in helping it to happen and giving him access, and then he turned out to be so nefarious. Well, Swamiji just immediately, I mean, within 24 hours, had written a powerful refutation of the entire article and sent it everywhere that he could send it. I mean, he just wouldn't stand for it. He wasn't nice. He didn't just sort of sit back and let people have their opinions and just sort of hold the space for people to feel whatever they wanted. He stood up and said, "This is absolutely false." He tells a story about that in the path when he was sitting at, it doesn't matter where, but he heard people saying bad things about Master. And as he said, after the lecture was over, he stood in the hall till they came out, and then he set them straight. So Swami respects that. You don't just let someone denigrate what you love and then just be silent in the face of it when you know it's false. So that's also why Durga appealed to Swami, and Swami saw, no, this is important. You know, this Atmananda was very important to Devi in his life and was disgraced falsely. Devi felt, and he felt the need to defend him, and Swami felt the need to allow Devi to do that, and he also began to feel that Devi was right. The fact that all of you loved him so deeply and sincerely was an important consideration for me. Another important consideration was the fact that one accusation against him had been that he used money from America to construct houses in his own name. Yet, when he was out of Yagoda Satsanga, when he was out of YSS, he was left without money, when ownership of all those houses would have made him rich. Someone, I decided, had to have been lying. What a tragedy. The defense against that, those who defended him said he came from an extremely wealthy family. And when he became a sannyasi, he repudiated all that family wealth. If he'd been attached to money, he had access to all the money he wanted. Why would he then, try to get money now? He could have had his family money at any point. And then Swami says, SRF has much to answer for, I'm afraid. And the pain that you and others experienced at the hands of Dubé, I could believe all of it. For I remembered how he talked. I mean, this is so after Atmananda was forced out, then this other man began to run the organization. And I could believe all of it, for I remember how Dubé talked, saying he would force everyone to come under his control. In fact, my greatest reason for leaving Calcutta and going to New Delhi, the headquarters of YSS was in Calcutta, and Swami was there and he was working under Dubé, but Swami felt he just couldn't get anywhere. So going to New Delhi was a good idea because New Delhi was the center of influence in 1958. India only became a country in 1948, so it was really where everyone was looking for leadership, and Swami just felt it was a far more dynamic and influential place to establish Master than Calcutta. But he also left because he simply couldn't work with Dubé. He was out of the question. In fact, my greatest reason for leaving Calcutta and going to New Delhi was that I simply couldn't stand being around him anymore, listening to his negative diatribes against all those people. Well, that sorrow is under the bridge now. I think Atmananda did not live very long after he was exiled. I think he developed cancer or something else, and so it was only a few years. So there was no reconciliation or rehabilitation or capacity for him to do what Swami did. Swami was expelled from SRF also under under a cloud and under false accusations and so on. But Swami was young enough and strong enough and had a very different destiny, so he simply built another work in Master's name. But Atmananda, I don't believe, lived very long after that. Well, that sorrow is under the bridge now, but I didn't feel that it would be right not to continue your thoughts to their own logical conclusion rather than omit them. What I have tried to do is make your account of him less personal, basing it more on principles. Devi, God bless you for this wonderful book. So once again, he goes back to it. I hope you like what I have done with it. Judging from the manuscript, I think it will come out in printed form to about 115 pages, which will be thick enough for a spine so the book can be placed on a shelf in bookstores with the title readable. I am sure we shall print it ourselves, and we will try to find a publisher for it also in India. This may well give you a good source of income. Devi worked all through his life, but he was by no means a wealthy man. He took up some relatively humble position. I think he became a mechanic of some sort, but he was getting older, and they don't have as much of a economic net for elders in India. It's all dependent on the family. So Swami wanted to help him. At first, I wanted to put only your name on the title page. As I worked on the book, however, I realized that it would be obvious to the reader that you could not have written it yourself in its present form. The English is too correct. So I decided to insert after your name something that is often done in such cases, with Durga and Kriyananda. In this way, if readers visit you in the expectation of finding you fluent in English, they won't be too shocked. I hope you like the title, Shaped by Saints. This is just what the book is all about. Everyone who has read it while I've worked on it has been thrilled by it. They say it sounds completely like you, except for that part near the end, which I've mentioned. I only finished the book this very afternoon and hasten to send it off to you in our Master's, Swami. Devi wrote back, just because the responses are not included here. Devi wrote back basically, thank you for writing the book I was trying to write. It's just wonderful. He was 100% enthusiastic and profoundly grateful that Swamiji thought enough of the manuscript to put his own energy into it. Devi would never have presumed to have asked him to do it. But far from being offended, he could see in the book what he was trying to make it. And I think that's also because, as Swami said, Swami tuned into him. It's also, I want to just give a little bit more energy to, because there's a very important principle being illustrated here. Durga saw this very strong statement against this man for what he had done. This is not the official SRF point of view about this man. He also did not live very long. He died, let's see, when would this have been? He might have lived a decade, but he didn't live as long. He was taken out. He got cancer and he died. I'm trying to think when it would have been. It might have been the early 70s. I don't think it was in the 60s. So what are we talking about? 58 to 62. Swamiji, that was when he met. He maybe lasted 10 years. But he didn't have a chance to really take over for good because he passed away. Swami had the belief that Master took him out. But who's to say? But the other point is here, Swami did not shy away from speaking truth frankly. Swami did not feel it was necessary. He definitely would not do it gratuitously. And that's why he writes in there, I can see how important this is to you. This is your story, and you feel that a great injustice was done. And Swami thinks that speaking about injustice is right. But then Swami says what he did with it, he tried to turn it into principle. He tried to make it less personal and more about principle. Because in the course of Swami's life, he spoke quite frankly at times about what he thought the leadership of SRF was doing correctly and not doing correctly. And he was quite frank about it. But he tried not to make it about personalities. He tried to make it about principles. Because there's no point in shying away from the truth in the name of being nice. If nice is not appropriate, it's necessary at times to stand up for what you believe. When I wrote Light Bearer, I didn't know how much of the controversy with SRF was going to end up in that book. I started when I finally got the feeling of how that book should go, which took me several years to really understand it. And it began, I reached the point of clarity and attunement where the book could begin to reveal itself for me. I realized it was going to be a chronological story. Every year, every chapter was 1 year. And to a very large extent, I was pretty strict that I only included in that chronological year things that happened in that chronological year. This was in stark contrast to the other book I wrote, which is Swami Kriyananda as We Have Known Him, in which these are stories of my and other people's experience with Swamiji, and it has absolutely no regard for time. In one story, I can pull in things that happened 10 years earlier and 20 years after, because each story illustrates some aspect of Swami's character, and so I would fill it out with whatever I wanted to say from whenever I wanted to say it, because it was the principles that mattered. The Light Bearer is completely the opposite. It's just year by year, and every year, as I say, I tried to make it strict, so that Swami's consciousness would gradually express itself as we experienced it. And once I understood that's how the book wanted to be written, that's how it happened. And so still, though, I had the question of, his relationship with SRF, because it wasn't pretty. And it wasn't, it was very important, but it wasn't the point. It wasn't intended to be the point. So I'm going chronologically. I meet Swami in 1969. I arrive at Ananda Village on June 1st, 1971. And I think I combined 69 up to 71. I think I made that all one chapter, but I don't remember now. I remembered the book vividly until it was published, and then it was done. So the next year is 1972. In November, as it happens, I had to look up the date for someone. On November 12th, 1972, Swami goes to India. And he hasn't been in India for 10 years. He hasn't been in touch with anyone he knows in India for 10 years. And he hadn't been able to go back to India for 10 years. And so this trip is a huge thing that he's doing. It's just it's the most important event so far in the book, except that I had arrived. But my arrival only launches the book. It's not the book. So I have to explain why he hasn't been able to go to India for 10 years and why this is such an intense trip, which means I have to suddenly, the second or the third chapter of the book, I have to break the chronology and go back to 1962 and explain the whole kerfuffle with SRF and how he came to be out on his own. And really, I'm all alone in seclusion with this book. I'm not alone in seclusion because Swami was right on my shoulder and he was talking to me the whole time. And I saw suddenly that this is what I had to do. And it was like I barely started the book. And all of a sudden I have to talk about this internal dispute between disciples of the same master. And I remember just sitting there going, oh no. But there was absolutely no way to write the book except to be authentic. And of course, that experience and that constant persecution and the relationship he had with all those people, it was the defining reality of his life. And it was also the defining reality of how he understood his discipleship and how he built Ananda. How he built Ananda was in relationship to how others were presenting Master and his teachings. So there was no way, there was absolutely no way around it. So I just took it as, this is what had to happen. And I certainly had many examples from Swamiji when if it was the truth and if it was what the situation demanded, then you just clearly and as impersonally and as fairly as you possibly can, you just speak the truth, because you have to speak the truth. You can't always be covering things up. Yet in other circumstances, bear in mind, speaking of Swami Kriyananda as we have known him, one of the stories that's in there is about when they were first starting the work in India. This man who was a good friend of Swamiji's actually removed $10,000 from the bank account. And Swami just let him do it. He said, for most people, money is more important than friendship. He said, for me, friendship is more important than money. And as he put it, if Divine Mother wants us to have that money, she'll give it back to us in another way. And the way he said it was, that man feels justified in his own mind for having done that. And he said, if I humiliate him by exposing him, he said, he'll just harden in his self-justification. And that's where Swami said, and he's been a friend to me for many years, and I don't wish to lose the friendship. I'd rather lose the money. So it wasn't as if unequivocally Swami felt that hard truths need to be spoken and all transgressions need to be exposed. It was only if there was a principle involved, and that principle was important. In Light Bearer, the principle was how you deal with adversity, and even a more profound principle is, what is Master's teaching? What is Master's teaching? And SRF and Ananda have approached it very differently. There's room on this planet for all of us. There's no need whatsoever for us all to be of one mind about this. It only mattered when one side tries to expunge the other side, and then it becomes difficult, and that was what we were coping with. But here, Swami, I'm saying this because there's a principle involved. This wasn't just let let Devi Mukherjee have his say. There was also a principle involved, and when Swami wrote, and I remember how he wrote it, he writes about the erroneous principles that the man expressed. Not merely he was a bad person, but these are the principles that guided his thinking, and these are why perhaps they're better principles to guide your thinking. And that's how I tried to also present Swami to the best of my ability. These are very important questions for devotees, because we get confused. Truth is fundamental, but bluntness, what do I want to say? Truth is fundamental, but truth and fact are not always the same. Sometimes facts have to be presented, sometimes facts are not important. With that money that man took, the facts were unimportant. The truth was they were friends. And Swamiji did not want to injure the friendship to no purpose, because there would be no understanding on the part of the friend. He would only feel betrayed. So Swami just let the money go. But in the case of Devi Mukherjee, and I pray that I was rightly guided in the writing of Light Bearer, Swami said, no, we have to say this like it is. Swami himself certainly did, especially even at the end of his life. He said it all very clearly. He never stopped saying it. I mean, I meditate on these things. I don't have unequivocal answers. I observe, I reflect, I learn. We all are learning all the time. So be it for Devi Mukherjee. I didn't know it'd spend the whole evening on it, but it was well worth doing. Okay, so let's go on. I think we have a couple of other letters that we can get to before our evening is over. This is now in the early 1990s. And this is response to comments on the book Crises in Modern Thought. Swami wrote Crises in Modern Thought, which is now called Out of the Labyrinth, and I do have a copy of it right here. Out of the Labyrinth. And I think that is what it still looks like. Swami wrote this book in 1972. It was actually also part of 1972. It was also actually part of 1962. When Swami, just before Swami was expelled from SRF, Master had told him that he needed to write books and do a lot of, well, especially write. He had to write books. And Swami could never, just looking at the way he was being utilized within SRF and the expectations that those in charge had of how he would use his time and what he would do, it was hard for Swamiji to see how he was going to be able to fulfill Master's instructions to him. And a lot of the instructions that Master gave him, he never actually shared with those he subsequently put in charge of SRF. So Swami had personal instruction from Master that no one else had heard, so that he had to assert what Master wanted for him against the judgment of others. So he did not know how this was ever going to work out. And 6 months before he was expelled from SRF, he read an article in an American diplomatic magazine or something like that. It was a magazine published by the U.S. government outside of the country for State Department workers or something like that. And it was about a lot of the modern trends in philosophy and how they all lead toward a nihilistic philosophy, the power of materialism. And Swami read the article and he thought, but Master's teachings draw very different conclusions from all those ideas. And he had the thought in his mind that he could write a book that would contradict the sort of nihilistic philosophy that people are accepting with the ancient Vedantic teachings as expressed by Master. But Swami sort of didn't know how he would ever have time to write such a book. And then 6 months later, he was expelled from SRF. And he realized, oh, now I have all the time I need to write this book. So he started working on it. And to work on it, he had to immerse himself in all these modern philosophies, nothing that he was, that he had a sympathetic resonance with. But he wanted not to just dismiss them as foolish, but he wanted to go inside the logic of each philosopher's point of view, but show how from that very same perspective, there was completely other answers that would lead you to an uplifted, expanded view of reality. And it was crises in modern thought, is what he called it. It was meant to be the first chapter of a book that was going to show Sanatan Dharma and how self-realization is the basis of all true spiritual thought. It turned out to be a book in itself. It turned out to take him 10 years to write it. And so he finished that book. The first copy of that book was put in his hand in November of 1972, just before he left for India. So it was like this whole completion of a whole decade-long cycle. Later, he rewrote the book completely, and he called it Out of the Labyrinth, for those who want to believe but can't. When Swami was living, one of the ways to really get and I'm joking when I say this, brownie points with him, was to say you'd read this book. Because he didn't really write it for devotees. He wrote it for those who want to believe but can't. And it has brought many people to this teaching. He considers it to be one of the most important books he's written and the foundation of all the rest of the work he's done. But it hasn't gotten as much attention as he'd hoped it would. Although now it's a fundamental book in the education for life training. And so there you have it. It's a very, very good book, but it's very different. So now, it was called Crises in Modern Thought at this time. Please forgive me for not answering your kind and thoughtful letter sooner than this. Thank you for correcting me on the question of the terms relativism versus relativity. You are, of course, right. I'll try to change the text accordingly before the next printing, assuming there is a next printing, which I hope there is, since 26 years of study and thought went into the writing of this book. I feel its conclusions are desperately needed today. Swami had an amusing detachment from his own work. If we ever print it again, which I hope we do, it's only taken me 26 years to write it. But there it was. He knew he was writing for the future and not for the present. But also, there he was. Somebody corrected him. And he said, oh, yes, of course you're right. There was no defensiveness. Yes, I'll make a note and we'll fix it. As for the first chapters, they were the hardest part and represent my best try, I'm afraid. I couldn't possibly go into all that matter again. It took a great amount of willpower to stay with a study that was, in fact, wholly uncongenial to my tastes and inclinations. My own expertise, if you want to call it that, comes from 40 years of commitment to the teachings of Vedanta. during which time I have labored to apply their clear vision to the universal problems of modern life. I'm curious for a moment to know what the copyright is on this, because he's already speaking. Well, 2001, and this was written in the 2000s, so whoever is talking about this book is already talking about this one. Even maybe Swami didn't get he did get the title, but maybe he hadn't when this was there. Response to comments on his book, Crises in Modern Thought, probably more accurately. Oh, there it is a footnote, later called Out of the Labyrinth. But by the early 2000s, since that's, oh no, excuse me, this is the early 1990s. I'm wrong. So even though Swami says that the early chapters represented his best effort, the fact is, a few years later, he found a better effort for it. But at the time, Swami felt like he's done it. I think also by the 90s, well, we were engaged in litigation, but I think Swami just didn't feel like going back into that world. That's what he said. I just don't want to go back there and have to think it out again. I know what you mean about wishing I'd made the point more strongly that modern physics is no longer materialistic. Again, Swami's just so generous. I know what you mean. I understand. It's a limitation of the book. If somebody makes a good point, he doesn't defend it. He doesn't feel the need to be always right. If somebody says something that's true, he says, sure, I know what you mean. He says, not being a physicist myself, I'm not sure how strong I can fairly make my statements on its present-day positions. But I felt the argument would in any case be strengthened by understatement, where the reader supplies his own affirmation on the point. Throughout the book, indeed in all my writings, I lean toward understating positions in which I myself actually believe quite passionately. So now there's another point about Swami's writing. This is one of the instructions he gave me for writing, and it also extends to speaking. Don't tell people how they're supposed to feel. He said, express the situation to them, give them the facts, give them the ideas, but don't then draw the conclusions and hammer them home. You will feel so free after you accept this idea. You will have a joyful experience. You will feel uplifted and your life will be changed. It's better still. Swami just said, just tell them what the truth of it is, and then leave them the freedom to draw their own conclusions. There's many reasons for that. One is understatement is the essence of good taste. That's one of the reasons why you should do it. It's more refined. The other is, if the reader has the freedom to draw his own conclusions, he'll be more kindly inclined toward the author. It's the author or the speaker. It's nice not to be beaten over the head with somebody else's point of view. You want to be awakened to a point of view that you yourself can freely come to, not feel that if you're in tune or if you have any intelligence at all or if you love me, you're going to think like this. It's rather give them the facts, state the facts, and then let them draw their own conclusions. It's been very interesting when I've been working with my writing especially, and then editing it. And I would see in so many places where I'd really already made the case. And instead of then writing out the conclusion that I might passionately feel, it was actually stronger when I took it out. And that was a strange sort of thing that I began to understand. It was stronger when I didn't emphatically insist upon it, because then truth speaks for itself. If truth needs me to defend it, it makes the author look, actually oddly enough, it makes the author look weak rather than strong. If you're very confident in what you say, you don't have to hammer it home. You just say what it is and the conclusions are obvious. Also, from the point of view of trying to draw people to self-realization, which is, of course, what we're trying to do with everything that we're doing. We're trying to bring Master's teachings to people. It's not a dogmatic teaching, and it is not a teaching that you can follow if you've only believing it because somebody insisted really strongly that it was true. The only way you can actually follow the path of self-realization is that if you yourself have seen the obvious truth of it. And so Swami also writes the way he writes because it's appropriate for the intention of his writing, which is to awaken that wisdom in other people and have it actually be their own conclusion. I mean, they will get magnetism from the writing or from the speaking because it's self-evident that I'm committed to this. I don't have to, there's a phrase for it that I'm not actually able to think of at the moment that means that when you're just too much on point, just too strong, too much on the nose, I think is how they say it. It's better to just have it be right there. And you get a feel for it if you're writing after a while. You begin to see. That's why, too many adjectives, too many declarative sentences. You have to be just a little conscious in both speaking and writing of exactly what you're saying. So he was saying, let's see, throughout the book, indeed, how does he put it? I felt the argument would, in any case, be strengthened. The argument would be strengthened by understatement. And whoever it was suggesting to Swami that he make it more explicit. No, he said, I think it's stronger for being understated. And the result, as I was saying earlier, will also be better. And then he says again, thank you again for your thoughtful letter. And see, Swami again is giving very true compliments. He didn't necessarily agree with what the man suggested for the reasons he explained, but he could tell that it was a thoughtful letter. It hadn't just been tossed off. The person had really considered carefully what he said. And a thoughtful letter, to compliment someone for a thoughtful letter, that's actually a very nice compliment. And it's a way that you can not agree with someone, but still commend them for what they've done. And again, this is when you go through Swami's writing, you see how carefully and truthfully he always responds, and encouragingly. And if you thank someone for a thoughtful letter, they'll be inclined to write you another one because they feel respected. The friendship, the communication will go on. I wish we could meet, but since we live far apart, it is not likely. Even when I go to Europe, which is fairly frequently, it is more often to the continent, whereas I get the impression that your connections are more in England. In any case, I look forward to reading your books. I have no idea who wrote this letter to Swami, but obviously they were a writer and a thinker on their own. So Swami was able to talk about his own position and what he was thinking, and even to be able to say, I've done as well as I can, I'm not going to be able to do any better. He's talking to someone who's a colleague, at least in this way. And then he signs the letter, sincerely, J. Donald Walters. So this was really a professional, that's how Swami writes this book, the authorship, because he felt Swami Kriyananda would be not a help and even a hindrance, because people would think it was a different kind of book than it is. So he used J. Donald Walters for certain ones of his writing that he wanted. Incognito is not quite the word, but that's sort of what he wanted to do. He felt that Kriyananda would be off-putting and Walters would be easier to accept. So this was apparently an exchange like that. So my friends, from Shaped by Saints to Out of the Labyrinth, so we've gone a lot of places tonight, and I hope you have enjoyed it. God bless you.